Good morning, everybody. I would like to thank Bertha and also follow suit and recognize the original peoples on whose land we are currently standing and honor that. I also like to thank Tracy in particular and her organizers for inviting me. I'm really sincere in saying that I'm absolutely delighted to be here because you folks are doing the important work around the province and making a huge difference. And I learned so much from people that are in your kinds of roles. When I first started doing my doctoral research, I wanted to know why is it that nurses were doing such a bad job of recognizing and responding to women that are battered. And I asked directions as to, well, how would I find out what really goes on in the community? And I was sent to a VAWIR committee and quickly pressed into service, actually. And I learned so much from people working in shelters, working in victim services, working in various aspects of the work in the communities across the province that I think is just invaluable. So I really treasure the opportunity to speak with you this morning. So, it's odd when you get old, right? You have a choice. You can either read what you've written or you can see the people. It's the choices are not optimal. Okay, so my title was just an opportunity for me to hopefully break into song, break into a little Tina Turner ditty, but I'm not going to give you that pleasure, okay? Yeah, maybe later. Okay, what I thought I would like to do is I'd like to tell you about some research that we're doing. And I wanted to take an opportunity to report to you the sort of findings of this study on the health effects of violence over time, and then maybe consider what the implications might be for your work. And then talk to you a little bit about an intervention that we've been working on. And I hope that you are going to be interested, and I hope that that'll become clear why I hope you're interested as I go. I'm here doing a little bit of a sales pitch at the same time. Okay, so first of all, I just wanted to say that there are a number of current trends in the research world in relation to the area of violence, and I focus primarily on violence against women. But this is a trend that crosses, I think, all forms of violence, that people are increasingly now looking at the effects of cumulative abuse across the lifespan, and cumulative abuse not just on individuals, but on groups and on communities, so that there's increasing recognition that you can't just pay attention to single instances or even single individuals in terms of addressing violence, but rather that, as you folks all well know, child abuse has an impact, and then sexual assault has an impact, and then partner violence has an impact, and it builds and it builds and it builds. And for me as a nurse and as a health researcher, it's absolutely critical to pay attention to that because it has direct impacts on bodies over time. Further, and related to that, there's an increasing recognition and attention to the idea of structural violence. So, historical violence, colonialism, poverty, how these all play out on people's bodies and lives, and increasing attention so that we're not just focused on single individuals experiencing particular instances of violence, but a much broader approach. And the third thing is, I want to say one more thing about that. A third thing that isn't on that slide is the profound physiological effects of trauma and stress, and the effects of living in that, and how that actually changes our bodies. So I was just at the Institute of Gender and Health's big conference in Toronto, and that it was all over the place. A real understanding that, no surprise that Aboriginal people have higher levels of diabetes, not because just of destruction of traditional approaches to food gathering and so on, but because of chronic stress actually changing one's bodies and, in fact, changing genetics. So I think that's also part of that recognition. And the fourth thing, then, is I think that there's an increased attention to intervention, to making a difference, and to seeing how are we making a difference, and being explicit about trying to intervene and needing to do so at all levels. So not just improving intervention with individuals, but with communities and at a level of policy. So those are three of the trends, or four of the trends, within which I'm trying to contribute a little bit. So I'm bringing with you a big team, and behind this is the team that has conducted the research that I'm going to tell you about, and behind that big team is a sea of women that have participated in our research. So I want to begin by thanking them. So I'm going to tell you about the Women's Health Effects Study. It's obviously the Women's Health Effects of Violence Study, but we use the term Women's Health Effects Study in part to improve safety for people participating. And what it is we followed 309 women over 5 years, and the women were from British Columbia, New Brunswick, and Ontario. And the stars are a little bit inappropriately placed, because there were, in the British Columbia sample, for example, there were women from Prince George, Williams Lake, Kamloops, Kelowna, and Victoria, and throughout the lower mainland. So what we did is we followed these 309 women, and it was amazing because 80% of them stuck with us from the beginning, and for 5 years allowed us to interview them and collect all kinds of information from them. And as you can see, this is a community sample. So by that I mean we didn't start with a shelter. We started with advertisements in newspapers and radios and those kinds of things, flyers and wherever. And we tried to get as diverse a sample as possible. But we also limited it to the ages of 19 to 65. We didn't get any 64 and 65-year-olds, in part because we were looking at health, and we didn't want to confuse things with the processes of aging. And we also only looked at women who had left abusive male partners. Okay, so this is a limitation. The women were they were well educated, but just slightly better educated than the Canadian population, pretty similar. And these women had been out of their abusive relationship, their most recent abusive relationship, for an average of 20 months. And so we asked them between 3 years and between 3 months and 3 years. That's who we were trying to get. You can see that to some extent, Aboriginal women were slightly overrepresented in terms of the population. That doesn't really mean much. And we were restricted by the fact that we were conducting everything in English, so that also was a limitation. I just want to point out to you, though, that only 16% of the women had access to shelter. So this is a different population than you might see. It's very much a community sample, which is a little bit unusual in research on violence. Okay, the women were poor. You can see that their annual incomes were kind of right around, hovering around the poverty line, and this isn't adjusted for family size. So 50% of the women had at least one dependent child living at home. So it's even a little bit worse than this. A third of them were on social assistance, 10% of them were on disability, and 3% were trying to get on disability. The thing that was overwhelming was the extent to which the women found it very difficult to live on the money that they have. And just as a bit of an aside, I'm really trying to work hard with other people doing research in housing, research in substance use, research in poverty, whatever, to join forces to really try to work toward limiting the impacts of structural violence, i.e. poverty, because I think we all ought to be joining forces, because that's, of course, as you well know, one of the biggest impacts on certainly on the health and well-being of people that have experienced violence. Okay, so these women had experienced all kinds of violence. We had just asked, have you left an abusive partner within the last 3 years, and would you like to participate in a study? What we weren't prepared for was the overwhelming levels of child abuse and sexual assault and other forms of violence that the women had experienced. So 80% of them had experienced some form of child abuse. 40% sexual assault by a partner other than the partner that they left, and most of the for the women who had children, 88% of them said that the children had witnessed violence. Now, most of you would not be surprised by that. Importantly, the women, when we interviewed them the first time, 50% of them said that they were still experiencing ongoing harassment. So this just gives you one little picture. Now, what we wanted to do was we wanted some way of dealing with that. And you folks know that there are many different patterns, but I think what gets in the public mind often is that this idea of a woman running out the door in the middle of the night, and she's just left one abusive partner, and that is kind of the focus. So what we did was a technique, a statistical technique, to try to get some patterns in this. And we found that the women sort of separated out into 4 different kinds of profiles. The first profile, which you'll see on your left, were women, we are calling it Ipv Dominant. These are women who had maybe 2 partners, like on average 1.6, 1.5 partners. They had very little, almost no child abuse, and they had 22% of them had experienced sexual assault. All of the women in our study had experienced pretty significant, no matter how you measure it, intimate partner violence. But this is one pattern, and so you can see at the very top in red, that's 28% of the women kind of fell into that pattern. 20% of the women fell into a somewhat different pattern. They had some child abuse that lasted a duration of about 7.6 years. 16% of them had experienced sexual assault, but these women they had one partner and one partner only. And the partner relationship that they had left lasted on average 11 years. Now, the other 2 patterns are quite different, and we called the first one lifetime sexual assault, multiple partners. So you can see that these women had on average had 3 partners. And they had moderate to severe child abuse that lasted about 9 years, and 55% of them had experienced sexual assault, and the duration of the abuse from the most recent partner was just over 5 years. And the final pattern is very similar but severe. I call it severe everything. So it's a different sort of pattern, and in this case, the women had severe child abuse that lasted almost 12 years on average. 60% of them had been sexually assaulted by somebody other than their intimate partner, and on average about 3 partners as well. So I think that that's really important, because you know that there are different partners, different patterns, but I think that that is not widely known in the way we try to understand the impacts on health, and that's kind of our purpose. So the women had really, in overall, very poor health. And these are women living in the community. They're women who are not necessarily connected with services such as you provide. They had, I'll just point out some of the most significant findings that we got, and one of them was the levels of disabling pain, severe disabling pain. And one thing that hasn't, there's a lot written about pelvic pain, but there's not written anything that we could find written about the levels of arthritic pain that women experience. And the women that we interviewed, these 309 women, had amazing joint pain, very severe arthritic pain, which is another thing that's also seen in the Aboriginal community, and I would suggest has a physiological connection to living under stress over a longer period of time. Injury plays a role, but injury isn't the whole thing. And we've got lots of papers on that if anybody's interested in some dense reading. dense and boring reading, yes. Okay, so you probably wouldn't be surprised. 48% of these women had PTSD symptoms that would be consistent with, moderate PTSD, and some had higher, more significant PTSD. And many of the women, in fact, most of them had symptoms of depression. So almost 60% of them had symptoms of high, severe depression. Okay. So what happened over time? This is a longitudinal study, and we got to look at the women's experiences over, and this shows you that it's kind of over 7 years, because we had to move all the women back to the start point of when they left the abusive partner. So we took 1 year out as being the starting point. So even though we only followed the women for 5 years, some of them, when we met them, had just left, and some of them were 3 years out. So we kind of took everybody back to a baseline. So it shows a picture over 7 years. And as you can see, and as we would hope, there were, in fact, changes in depressive symptoms. Now, some of the women had ongoing harassment, but that ongoing harassment also decreased over time. So, and that made a difference. Now, I want to point out two things to you. One is that the women still had high levels of depression. When you look at the bottom, where they got to after that number of years, they're still above the threshold. 16 would be the threshold for being consistent with clinical depression. So they're not depressed. They've had an improvement in their depressive symptoms. Now, what mattered about where they started was the extent to which they'd experienced child abuse and the severity of the intimate partner violence that they'd experienced in the first place. So that mattered where they started. So what you're seeing on the far left-hand side was their numbers when they started, and where they ended also was affected by the extent to which they'd experienced child abuse and the experience of the severity, of the intimate partner violence. Same picture with PTSD. The PTSD over time improved, but they still have symptoms on average. This is across the sample. On average, they did have better symptoms. That is to say, their symptoms were reduced. Okay, drum roll. Thank you. Oh no, sorry. Drum roll on the next one, sorry. So we artificially, as you can see, kind of separated physical and mental health. And to summarize the mental health, they had the similar kinds of patterns of improvement, but they still had substantial mental health symptoms even 7 years after leaving. The past child abuse and the severity of intimate partner violence explained the change over time. And this you didn't necessarily see, but the women who had more severe ongoing abuse had less improvement. Now, you wouldn't be surprised by that. But what we don't know is there's still a lot of variation, and we're trying to figure out to what extent socioeconomic status, such as income and also social resources and social support, make that difference in the change, because we think that's where intervention could occur. Now the drum roll. Okay, here's a picture of changes in physical functioning. You'll see that it's a flat line. Okay, there's no change. And this is drawn from a functional measure of health. That shows the extent to which your health really interferes with your activities of daily living, kind of thing. And over time, there was no improvement at all. Now, where the women began depended again on child abuse, age, not surprising, age, and the severity of intimate partner violence. So this is really, really important to know that women's physical health is not improving up to 7 years out of a relationship, okay? I'm just going to show you a similar thing using a different measure. These are the changes in chronic pain. No changes. No changes. And this is very important. It's very important for a whole bunch of things. Employment, not the least of them, okay? They've got high levels of chronic pain, and the chronic pain isn't going away even though they've been now out of the abusive partnership, and some of them were repartnered, but not a high number of them repartnered, and certainly not a high number of them with abusive partners. And we've taken that into account. That is to say, ongoing violence, whether it's from a previous partner or a current partner. So we aren't seeing changes in chronic pain, and I think that's a very important thing for us to take into consideration. So there was a lot of variation in their physical health when we first interviewed the women, and that varied according to child abuse, IPV severity, and age. But there wasn't any change over time, and we've been really puzzling on this. Now, the first explanation is that your body changes, and those changes are very difficult to reverse. We know that. We've got like mouse models showing the effects of stress on the body, and we've got all kinds of research showing that. And the other thing is, but the other things that we have to take into account is that we may have missed some big changes in that first year because we didn't have measures for most of the women in the first year. And the other thing is we're not sure, and this is important to us as health researchers, whether it's the fact that a lot of our services are geared to really helping people with their mental health. We've got a lot of counseling, we have support, we have people like you doing the work, but not a lot of attention to people's physical health. So I'm going to show you a little bit more about that. Women were using, as you, I think, probably know, they were using health services at very, very high levels. They were using health services at way higher levels than population levels, but they were also, in many cases, unable to access the help that they thought they needed in terms of their health. So this is just giving you some examples, and they probably aren't going to surprise you that much because where they had the biggest difficulty in access was, first of all, family doctors. You know the situation with family doctors in BC. These aren't all women from BC, by the way. New Brunswick and Ontario is in here. And you also know that we have very poor dental coverage and also difficulty with accessing dentists. So those were the big ones. Not the only ones, though. And a similar kind of picture with mental health services. Mental health services were very hard to get for some of the women, but women were really accessing a lot of services and really trying to get the help that they needed. Okay, so this is just some examples, and I just throw those up as examples. We did a comparison for all the different kinds of service use, and I just want to make a little point in that there was much less difficulty in accessing advocacy, social assistance support, the kinds of things that you folks would probably either provide or connect them up with. They did not have a lot of difficulties in accessing in those areas. It was the health stuff where the difficulties were. So I just wanted to make that point. But as you can see, the column on your left is this sample, how they used services. The column on your right is what the population level of use would be, and the difference column just subtracts those two. So you can see that the women are much more likely to use a food bank than women of the same age in the population, much more likely to use GPs, much more likely to make visits to the emergency, and so on. So you may know that we haven't had any costing of the costs of violence against women since 1995 in Canada. So we tried to calculate what this is costing. Now remember, these are women who have left abusive partners. So this is a very small segment. And what we did was we costed all those things and then added them up to produce a per woman annual cost. So there's a couple of things I'm trying to show with this. First of all is this $13,000 per year over and above what the women of the same age in the population would use in terms of health and social services and so on. That's the first thing. The second thing, what I'm trying to show you here, and this is very, very partial, right? We only counted certain things, and we missed all kinds of other things that we couldn't count or we couldn't find comparisons with. And again, this is a paper that's coming out in Canadian Public Policy, so if you're interested in it, very happy to share it with you. The other thing that I'm trying to show here is that there's shifts. Costs are borne. Doesn't matter what you do, costs are going to be incurred. You can close employment bridging programs, but the costs are going to show up somewhere. And so in some cases, what we've done is we've shifted the cost to charities, we've shifted costs to individual women, we've shifted costs to families and friends, but the costs are still there. Okay, so that's kind of part of what I'm trying to show. I'm walking a tightrope here because on the one hand, I want to show the costs. On the other hand, I don't want the message to be, oh, women are costing too much. That's not my goal, right? I need your help. Okay, so I calculated this then for the country. And if you took the number of women who had left abusive partners and had experienced violence within the preceding 3 years, which is a little bit closer to our sample, that overall cost would be $3.1 billion annually. If, however, and there's a logic that you could support this, if you included all women who'd ever left abusive partners, and we can see that the physical health is not improving for these women so far as we've measured it, so I don't think it's unreasonable, then that would be $6.9 billion. Remembering that we only counted certain things. There's no drug costs in this, for example, okay? We couldn't figure out a way to do that. We calculated the costs of moving for those women that moved. But we couldn't find a way to do a proper comparison. So there's all kinds of costs that aren't in this. This is just very partial. Okay, what does this mean for you? Well, why would this be of interest? I mean, the first thing that I think is that the people that you are dealing with, and I can't make any claims beyond women that have left abusive partners, but we certainly know that child abuse has profound physical and emotional health effects. We certainly know that violence, whether it's against men or women, has these profound effects. So I'm only making claims about the women that I studied, but you are constantly dealing with people who have physical and mental health symptoms and problems and challenges. And, I think we really need to take a close look at our understanding of substance use, for example. Substance use doesn't come out of nowhere. There is a reason that people who are abused as children or sexually assaulted, who experience intimate partner violence, use substances at high levels. There's a reason. And it's not just that they're in their head somewhere, they're trying to deal with the abuse. We've got to get rid of that simplistic notion and understand that these are deep physiological effects that go on for a long period of time. And unless we deal with people's histories of trauma, and unless we deal with their actual pain, then we're starting at the wrong door when we start at the substance use door. Okay, I get down off my soapbox now. I know I'm talking to a pretty friendly audience, though. So the symptoms that people experience really do interfere with all kinds of things. The ability to get employment, just the ability to carry on with life, the ability to parent if that's part of a person's life, and so on. And I think that you are dealing with significant symptomology sometimes when you're dealing with people who are challenging to deal with, probably have significant health challenges that they're also dealing with. The other thing is that you know probably as well as I do the difficulties that people face in getting access to health care and getting access to non-stigmatizing, non-judgmental, accepting, responsive, appropriate health care. So, we think it's quite problematic that there's such symptom interference, and we actually asked not just about symptoms, but interference. And the symptom interference is enormous, but there's very, very little attention to that. And there just isn't anywhere in the system where somebody is responsible for that, or that women in this case can get help. So we also have, as you well know, to some extent, a very limited referral capacity, and when systems work in silos, it's very difficult to help people even access the help that they need. Is it really only 9:30? I'm doing really good. Okay. So what are the possibilities? And, I would really like to have some dialogue about this with you. I think that my goal in coming today is to really impress upon you the extent of these health impacts among the people that you are providing service to. I think that that kind of awareness, not just, of course, your work, but the work of healthcare providers, that's my job, is to try and help healthcare providers understand how violence affects people and how it affects people across the lifespan and how it is cumulative. And how to try to move out of a victim-blaming kind of stance, which is still very alive and well in the healthcare system, into a much more responsive and appropriate way of dealing with people. I think that we need to have way more partnerships, and I think the partnerships need to be at all levels. Some communities have really great partnerships, I know that. But I also know from my experience on some VAWER committees that healthcare providers are often the last to come to the table. And so really more effectively motivating partnerships, I think, is part of what I need to be involved in anyway. So I'm going to now show you a little bit about one way that we're trying to take this into action, okay? So we've tried out an intervention. We're trying out an intervention. And this thing is based on what I've just shown you, but it's also based on some a theory that my colleagues developed about how it is that women try to survive after they've left an abusive partner. And I keep talking about leaving, but we are actually trying to challenge some of the notions of leaving and whether or not that is the best concept for us to be operating from in a society in general. So what we're doing is we're offering this primary health care intervention, and it's delivered by a nurse in partnership with somebody who's, we call, in some provinces they're called domestic violence advocates, some places they're called victim services, some places they're called outreach workers. So in that kind of a partnership, we're trying to deliver this to see if it can improve people's lives. And it's 6-month intervention, 12 to 14 meetings. So it's based on this theory, and the theory is based on research with women who've left abusive partners. And what this showed was that women experienced extensive amounts of intrusion, what they called intrusion, which was unwanted interference from a whole bunch of sources. So the unwanted, you would automatically think of ongoing abuse, of course. Ongoing abuse, as you well know, is always an issue, whether somebody has left or not. But also unwanted intrusion from the costs of getting help. So, the family members who think that they should tell a person how to live their lives because she's had to move in with mom or the sister or whatever. So what are the costs to getting help? Not just the expenses, but the downsides. And the downsides of disclosing in a healthcare setting, and then having, being threatened with your children being apprehended or whatever. The intrusion from the unwanted changes to your life, like having to move into a trailer park or having to move your kids or whatever. Also, and then this is where we kind of come in, the unwanted intrusion from the health effects of violence that, as I've just tried to show you, are ongoing and significant and severe and unrelenting. So based on this work that they did, they found that women sort of worked in these kind of, the yellow circles show you the areas, managing the basics, just getting stuff, getting resources, and not just resources in terms of material resources, but enough energy to carry on. Oh, thank you. Managing their, first of all, I'll start with safeguarding, keeping themselves safe. So keeping themselves safe, but not just safety in terms of immediate safety from violence, safety and balancing that against taking risks. So putting yourself out there to, get a job, putting yourself out there to make some new connections, some new relationships. So a balance between those two things, trying to keep yourself safe at the same time trying to move on with your life. Cautiously connecting with other people, so figuring out in a reasonable way what is a useful relationship to me and what is going to get me in trouble. So, to take one example, sometimes the women in the study that they based this on would say, yeah, it's time for some life of my own, and I'm out dancing and I'm out drinking and I'm having a good time. And to some extent, people need to have their own lives and feel sort of a taste of freedom. On the other hand, they needed to figure out when that was serving them well and when it wasn't. Managing their symptoms, trying to focus on whatever they were, whether it was insomnia, whether it was nightmares, whether it was depression, whether it was pain, whether so on. And then trying to work to create a new family relationships. And I'm talking about whether they had children or not, the need to make new relationships, because as you will have all experienced, sometimes in-laws are threatening. Sometimes your own family of origin has things to say about the fact you've left a partner or whatever. So it's creating new relationships and a new set of supports. And then finally paying attention to themselves and taking time for themselves, which for some women was very, very difficult. So we've used this and the stuff that I was just showing you before to try and create this kind of an intervention. So it's based on these kind of 6 assumptions. First of all, that partner violence isn't just something that's committed by a particular perpetrator, but it's something that's sanctioned by broader social systems and society in general, and that leaving doesn't just occur as a kind of a single event, the one-time thing where you go on and you leave and you're gone and it's all better. That we need to have trauma-informed care everywhere. Now, you are all experts at trauma-informed care, but you also know that that some of the services to which you refer, and the healthcare system in particular, is not well informed by an understanding of the effects of trauma. So we've built this also on a harm reduction model, cultural safety model, and also on the idea that, of course, health is socially determined. So we can't attend to health without attending to the broader social determinants of health, including poverty, racism, geography, and so on. So the principles of this thing we've tried to be very, very clear about. And the first thing is that we privilege safety. The second thing is that we're going to prioritize health, and health broadly defined to encompass physical, mental, emotional, spiritual. We're not focusing on one aspect. We really try to draw very, very explicitly on the experiences of other women. So the first thing of this intervention is to elicit what the woman's story is, but then also say, okay, here's what other women have found. Does this resonate with your story? Does it match? Doesn't it match? Where does it differ? That kind of thing. So we're trying to explicitly draw on others' experiences. We're trying to stick with the woman's definition of who's important to her in her life, and also how she wants to proceed. And that we recognize that it's not that safety needs to be balanced against risk. Sometimes you need to borrow money if you're going to go back to school. It might be a risk, but we're supporting, the woman where she decides that she wants to take some risks. We're also sort of building on that understanding that help doesn't come without a cost sometime, and so we're trying to help women to weigh those costs very carefully. And as I said before, the women are the ones to kind of direct the pace and select what it is that's important to them in terms of proceeding. What we're trying to do is, and this is not what you call a multi-level intervention, but where we run into difficulties, then we are the person who's in the role of the interventionist is going to advocate for better systems change. So that's part of it, but it's not the main focus. So we do this kind of in 3 stages. First of all, we spend some time getting to know the person, finding out, and this is, again, a research study because we want to know, is it going to make a difference in people's lives? We discuss, what I've just discussed with you is what do we think we're doing here. We listen to her story, and we go over the kind of areas that we're offering kind of support in. And you'll remember I said there's an outreach worker and there's a nurse. So who does what depends on what the woman is seeing as her priority, because there's quite diversity in terms of what people want. Now, what we do in each of these areas that I've told you about, the idea of safeguarding and managing basics and so on, is we talk about, well, what's bad, what's intrusive for you, what's interfering with your life. Then we sort of look at, well, what are some of the options? What have other people found that works? What is available to you? And then where do you want to go, and how can we strengthen your capacity? So we're trying to keep it focused on the woman and really keep it strengths-based as opposed to deficit-based. Oh, okay, so then we do that for about 4 months, and then in the last month we're going to trying to transition out of that. That doesn't mean that the woman is left on her own. I mean, of course we've tried to put, if she needs ongoing supports, put those in place. So just to give you a little picture, this is just a little thing, a little tool that we would use to kind of explain in plain language what is it that we mean by these things. You know, so we explain this. Safeguarding, what do we mean by that is about feeling and being, not just physically, but also emotionally safe. So we would say, what is it that's you're concerned about? Where are your safety risks? What's making you feel unsafe, and so on, and then try to work with the woman if that is a priority. So this just gives you a little picture of in plain language what these kinds of 3 of the 6 areas are about. And we have like a gazillion of these tools that we use. Some of them we use with everybody, and some of them we don't use with anybody because the women aren't remotely interested in them. But this one seems to work as a kind of a starting point, and this is something that the outreach workers or advocates have been working with the most, and that is just going over the priorities in terms of what the woman sees as the basics, what she's got, and where she would like to go. So is childcare her priority? Or is it getting some reasonable form of transportation? Is it income? Is it food? Or is it leisure? And that sounds, to some people that sounds like luxury, but I don't think it is luxury. If we're talking about health, we know people need to have an opportunity to, get fit or to have some relaxation and so on. So we certainly have included getting leisure and energy as part of the basics, because if you're trying to rebuild a life and you've had multiple moves, then you need to have some source of energy to draw on. And if you consider how depressed the women in our community sample were, this is of vital importance to people's health. So this is the one where we work with symptoms, and what you see on the outside here are some of the symptoms that were reported by the women that we studied, the 309 women that I told you about, and we sort of show the women what are the really common symptoms, and then they could circle or tick or however they want to do it, the things that they experience. And this is pretty helpful, not only in trying to figure out, well, what are your symptoms? What is going on for you health-wise? But also helping the woman sort of put herself in context and go, oh, that's a very common thing. I didn't know that difficulty concentrating was a hugely common problem. And it helps to kind of normalize and depathologize some of the women's experiences as we go through these things. So they seem to find this one really helpful, and then the nurse and outreach worker can work on those over time to see what can be done. And there are all kinds of things that can be done for insomnia. There's all kinds of things that can be done for pain, but previously that hasn't been part of the package that women typically have been getting. Okay, so just to finish talking up a little bit, these are the 2 studies that we're doing. One is in Ontario, and we have 28 of the 30 women in this sample. And what we're going to do to see if it's making a difference is we've matched those women with women that are already in our study. So we're matching them on certain things like age and the severity of violence that they experience. We'll probably use that thing that I showed you where the women broke down into kind of 4 patterns. We might match them by pattern, that kind of thing. And in Ontario, what we did was we actually hired a very, very experienced advocate type person with, I think she has a social work background, and she is working on a team with 3 nurses. So they are carrying that caseload of 30 women and working with them. In that case, it's a little bit of a different model than in New Brunswick. In New Brunswick, we have 4 communities, and they're predominantly rural, well, Fredericton plus 3 fairly rural communities. Oh yeah, I guess Miramichi is urban. And we have 50 women in that study. And in that study, we have a great partnership because we have one of the biggest second stage organizations working with us, and we also have the government. We have a real champion in the women's issues branch of the New Brunswick government working with us. So they're all partners, which is really bodes well for us in terms of having some policy impact. So in that case, we explicitly hired an outreach worker and a nurse in each of the communities, and they work as a partnership team. And we actually are happier with that model. So what we're trying to do is figure out whether or not this will work and figure out whether it reduces those forms of intrusion that women experience. So not just trying to figure out whether they have reduced ongoing violence in their lives, but other forms of intrusion. We're trying to look at that as well and how we can strengthen their capacity. And we also want to know, is it actually improving their quality of lives? Quality of lives. No, quality of life? Quality of life. Well, there's multiple women, so I thought I should use plural. Okay, so here comes the sales pitch. So I've been personally working in a whole bunch of different communities, but most recently we've got a study in working with Central Ontario Native Health in Prince George and with Vancouver Native Health, looking at how they provide care and trying to, in the case of Vancouver, enhance their ability to provide services to women, because some of you may know it's quite threatening for women to come into a space where there may be a lot of men occupying the waiting room, and there's other barriers as well. So we've been doing that, and we would like to try this intervention if we think it's working in Ontario and New Brunswick, and so far it looks like it's working very well. We'd like to try it in British Columbia, and we would like to work with our Aboriginal partners to adapt it to an Indigenous context. And so here you see Mrs. Roberta Price, who's actually she's Tsawwassen, and she's the chair of our kind of advisory committee. So I'm hoping to try this out in British Columbia. I've put in funding, but I don't want to do it without partners. So that's my sales pitch. So that's me, and I would like to now invite you to respond, ask me questions,